Hi everyone, I'm Cole Failing, the first person in history to commit every crime. Today I'm doing another web shooter build, and this time I'm taking on the web shooters from the Amazing Spider-Man movies. A few months ago when I talked about my homemade web shooters, I mentioned that I was also interested in building the Andrew Garfield web shooters someday. Well, that day has arrived, which means that you get to watch me suffer through my creative process once again. While the homemade web shooters from Homecoming were a lot more mechanical in their design, the Amazing Spider-Man web shooters were a lot more electronic.
They were seemingly built inside of watch casings, making them incredibly thin. There's a button in the middle of the casing that lights up red, and a small readout off to the side that lights up green. The trigger of the web shooter is an orange ribbon cable with a tactile switch on the end.
Of course, I wanted mine to shoot webs just like the previous versions, but because of size limitations, Kevlar paracord is out and kite string is in. I also wanted to see if I could activate my web launching electronically, and while I'm at it, why not add the light effects from the movie as well? All of that has to fit into a 1.5 inch disc that is 1/4 of an inch tall. How hard could it be? So here was my plan for making the web shooters electronically activated. I was going to fit a tiny battery-powered electromagnet into the casing with a small tactile switch at the end of the ribbon cable that deactivates it. My barrel was then going to store a compressed spring with a launch dart made from a ferrous metal. When I hit the trigger, the electromagnet would turn off and the spring would decompress, launching the dart and webbing out of the web shooter, injuring no one. Rather than use existing watch casings, I decided to just machine my own. I reached out to the people at Sony to see if I could pull some of the dimensions from the screen-used web shooter props, and they very kindly told me that I was out of my mind. So I just eyeballed every single one of them.
I cut out the shape on the bandsaw and then removed the middle of the casing with my trademark method of drilling a bunch of tiny holes in a circle around the area I wanted to cut out. Then I loaded up the casing on the lathe to make the center cutout perfectly circular and elevate the central ring. Once the outer casing was made, I also machined the face on the lathe, drilling out as much space inside as I possibly could. Then I machined the launch barrel, taking care to add the straight knurl and the central groove when I made the tip. I drilled a hole into my casing and face and installed the barrel through both, and finally I milled out a slot into the casing and face so that I could insert the web cartridges.
It turns out they don't really make electromagnets small enough for my purposes, so I just ended up building my own. I wired it all up to a circuit that included red and green LEDs and was powered by one single button cell battery. Any more than that and the circuit wouldn't fit in the casing. In fact, it already didn't fit, so I ended up needing to file down the battery. People in the electronics biz tell me that's a big no-no, which just made me want to try it even more. I don't know if battery acid poisoning is technically a thing, but if it is, I have it. The face needed a few more cosmetic details, such as the 5 slots on the side that the LEDs shine through.
To make these, I machined a ring that would fit over the ridge on the face, and then milled 10 slots just as small as I could possibly make them.
Once I finished the slots, I cut them into blocks and attached them over the green LEDs that I had wired inside the casing. Now that all the hardware was assembled, it was time to test out the web shooters. Obviously, the normal way to test web shooters is to go to the tallest building in your city and test them for the first time mid-fall. But, lucky for me, my web shooters started having problems before I even got to the 5th story. You see, it turns out that a tiny electromagnet built by a man with a flirtatiously terrible grasp of electronics does not have enough magnetic force to keep a spring compressed. So I scrapped the flexible ribbon cable idea and cut new rigid triggers out of steel.
I used JB Weld to attach a stop block and hinge to the trigger, and then milled tiny slots into the launch barrel that the stop block would slide into. I removed the electromagnet from the circuit and attached the tactile switches for the LEDs to the ends of the triggers. When you press down on the tactile switch, it turns on the LEDs in the casing and pulls the stop block out of the launch barrel, releasing the spring, launch dart, and webs.
You know, sometimes I amaze even myself.
As a finishing touch, I sewed up a couple of leather wrist straps to hold the casings in place. I cannot overstate how much I prefer the design of these web shooters to the ones in the sequel.
Those of you who are only following my channel because of the web shooter builds will be ecstatic to know that I am already working on a 3rd pair. Comment below which pair you think I'm making next, and I will give a shout out to anyone who correctly guesses in my next web shooter video. Thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned for my next video where I will be stealing a mummy from the Natural History Museum. See you in hell.